Hello, and welcome to the After Effects Virtual Summit. We're going to be exploring Motion Control 3D, which is how to bring photos to life using After Effects. My name's Rich Harrington. I'd like to thank you for coming out for this class. It's one of my favorite techniques. What we're going to explore is how to actually step inside a photo and make it look as if we're moving through it. I'll show you how to go ahead and cut things up in Photoshop into pieces, and then add cameras in After Effects to add life to a photo. You're going to learn how to identify planes, in other words, places where there's depth, and then figure out the timing for your camera moves. I'll start in Photoshop, where we show you how to actually cut things up into layers using some of the more modern tools. And then we'll bring it back into After Effects, where we'll add a 3D camera, as well as then time out the scene and add some depth. My name's Rich Harrington, and I'm a visual storyteller. I primarily work in both photo and video. However, I am also a software designer who has been working with AI for the last decade. Along the way, I've put out many books and video courses, but I make my day job as a director and a photographer. So if you want to check out some of that training, you'll find it on places like Kelby Training, LinkedIn Learning, or lynda.com, and I might still be on your bookshelf. Along the way, I get to work on lots of cool projects. I mostly do work in the nonprofit space and the high-tech space. And I occasionally get brought into television stations to help them improve their workflow or to work with technology companies on some of their products. All right, I invite you guys to connect, but why don't we jump right in and get to the training. So here I am going to show you something that we built for a client, a project a long time ago. It was for a TV commercial, and we had a painting here that we wanted to bring to life. So this is the original painting, and rather than just doing a very straightforward scan, we mapped it to a 3D environment. Then we put the elements back in and started to add some different effects for lighting. Notice the flickers. And then a color grading pass. Well, this just makes it quite a bit interesting, and there's so much cool things you can do with this technique. Now, we've been using these techniques at my production company, Red Pixel. I invite you to check us out if you'd like to see some more. And this is one of the examples we're going to start by looking at this morning. This is a photo of my grandparents. Now, it's fairly low resolution, but I did that so it was a small file for people to download and play with. And we create some movement here. And here's another example of a picture just cut into layers. And as we move, the distance between the objects creates a parallax effect. Now, this is taking it to the extreme. This is a title sequence that we did for a feature film about the war. But what we were able to do here was really start to tell the story and bring things into 3D space. All of this was done with After Effects. All the 3D here is all being done inside the After Effects environment. And then we go into the very first shot of the scene for the documentary. It's one of my favorite pieces we've ever gotten to work on. And we're into the opening shot, which is live footage in this case. All right, well, why don't we explore this technique to get started? What's going to happen here is it's a pretty straightforward workflow. You're going to take a photo and extrude it into 3 dimensions. Then, once you've done this, we can actually start to animate the photo. So let me show you the end result here. Here we have the different pieces inside of After Effects. Let's turn them on one at a time. On the left, you're seeing a stage view. This is often referred to as custom view 1, which is about 45 degrees to the left and 45 degrees up. And there's our background. Then we have our couple. Let's turn the camera on so we're actually looking through the lens here. And you see what the camera sees. So here's the box of the camera pointed at our subject. And so that camera is going to start down here near the bottom and then move up. Now you might have noticed that there's no feet here. It looks like they're floating. That's because they were standing on the ground and we had some objects in front of them, some grass, which actually makes this an even cooler technique because as the camera floats up, it reveals our subject. You get an idea there of what's happening. Now, if I drag through, look at on the left, the pink box. That's showing you the physical camera as it's moving. And with a little bit of light and just some simple color grades, we're able to really bring this shot to life. All right, let's explore. On the Photoshop side, we had to cut this apart. And in order to do that, we're often given photos that have some depth. Here's two. Let me show you what's happening here. Let's open up these two images and just look at some of the depth of the scene. Here, I have a sense of perspective. The soldiers are marching in the parade. There's a crowd standing behind them with a building and a great light source here coming through the trees. In this one, we have a little bit of a sense of angle. And this works well. When we have angles, we can really kind of tell the story. Now, one of the things that's going to continue to extend this technique is some of the new generative AI that's here in Photoshop. I just want to show you something really quick. Let me select the border of this photo here. We'll just actually draw a box. There we go. And tell it to select the inverse. And then click Generative Fill and just let it add. And what you're going to see is that it does a decent job of extending the scene. This is going to open up new options as we start to work, although keep in mind that if you're doing documentary work, they're probably not going to be crazy about the use of Generative Fill, but that was still pretty cool how we were able to extend that. A little bit of touch up and everything else, but it's going to become quite possible to get a bigger photo to tell your story. All right. Let's take a look at those movies of what came here. So in this case here, with these two photos you saw, here's an example of animating them. Add a little sense of particle here with some light coming through the clouds. And we move across the building to the front to reveal it. And you see how we can tell our story there. Here's the soldiers. Same sort of simple particle effects, a little bit of light shining through the trees, and the soldiers are gently moving forward with the camera. Now, obviously, we can't make a photo convert to live footage with walking, but moves like this just pull people in, and it feels a bit magical.
We went over to camp visiting, during the day a lot after the other girls began to come down. I had my little brownie camera along, and I think I still have some of the pictures that I took with that little camera. We got around and had a good time while they were there. We were all together on the grounds there that evening. All the girls, their husbands, and Edith's boyfriend, we just sat around and talked, and this one guy came by, and I had, of course, my little brownie camera, and John, I asked him to take a picture. And he did. He took a picture of all of us. And finally, about dusk, John says, "Okay, man, fall in. We gotta go." It was the 22nd day of September, 1942. That was the last time that we saw him.
And that is a fear I've never forgotten. Never forgotten.
He spent many nights writing on his typewriter in the edge of the tent so he could get the light from the tent.
My precious John, your wife is really a happy girl today. Reason? 3 typewritten V letters.
My precious Lynn, you can see by the papers we are staying quite busy. So glad that you had a most enjoyable Christmas. As for myself, things could have been much better. Here I am daydreaming, and the war is a long way from being over. The longer I stay over here, the more homesick I become.
So what we've been able to do is tell a compelling story. So why don't we get this technique started? The first step you're going to need to do is choose images of an adequate resolution. What I suggest here is that you look at a photo with a critical eye. Sometimes you have to work with what you have, but the goal here is that you have enough. So you're going to want to try to make it work if possible. Ideally, look at the pictures you're given and try to decide which ones are going to come through. Remember, you may have to make some technical suggestions based on which photos have interesting angles, which ones are of adequate resolution, or try techniques like upscaling with Photoshop, or using that generative fill you saw to add some detail in. If a picture's out of focus, it's going to be difficult to improve this, although there is some great technology out there like GFP GAN that can help with regenerating the photo. And if the photo is cropped too tightly or lack headroom, add some of it back in. You can use things like the content aware fill or the generative fill in Photoshop or cloning. But ideally, look for movement or motion. Also, you need at least two planes. All the examples I've shown you have had depth. So ideally, you could find a foreground, a subject, and a background, or your subject and a depth to the background. Ideally, we also start with adequate resolution. So if you're delivering in 4K and you need almost 4,000 pixels across, that means you probably need 3 to 5 times as many pixels to start with, so you can do zooms or camera moves. Think about the screen width and just multiply it by your zoom ratio. That'll give you a good minimum width. Then, as you take a look, it's time to sort of plan out the move as if you were a director examining this. I recommend that you block your moves out in After Effects. Maybe think of the key starting and end position of the camera. You can do this by looking through the virtual camera and just kind of figure things out. It also could be helpful to create a staging diagram to just sort of draw out what's going to happen. Think about the amount of separation, the distance between the foreground, the subject, and the background. More distance means more ability to use depth of field effects, as well as really take advantage of that parallax effect for the sense of movement. Think of it this way: your subject, the foreground, and then the background. That's the example we saw here. Here's the original photo before I did any conversion on it. My grandparents standing by their house. Now, what happens here is parallax creates the concept of movement because of objects that are nearby or further away. As you increase the distance and you move the camera, it creates that virtual effect. Let's go back to After Effects here. And let's set this to a 4 view. And now we've got a little more space to see what's going on. On the bottom left here, we're taking a look at the right-hand side of the image. See what's happening here? Let me just drag this through. The camera is rising up. And as it lifts up, it also moves a little closer towards our subject. The light is stationary though, because it's like the sun shining down. Now, looking at that from that distance, it seems to me like maybe the light isn't perfectly positioned. So I can slightly rotate that light if needed, as well as pull it a little further away by grabbing the Z-axis and moving it back. And you see it updates. Looking at the scene kind of helps you understand the relative relationship between things. In this case, the camera is pretty close on purpose. Now, if we look here on the right, this view here is just showing us from the very front of the scene. It's as if I'm standing on set and I could see the back of the camera. It's kind of hard to tell what's happening here though, but you see all the layers composited in space. If you want to change one of these views, you can click on the drop down here and look at different angles. This can kind of help you better understand what's going on in the scene. So in this case, custom views are helping me out. And over here, I'm taking a look from the top down on the set, so I can see my different pieces to really help space it out. Well, as you do this, it becomes easier to understand things, but you also may want to get a little organized. For example, I can change the label color here and maybe make that grass be green. And then I'll set the couple to a peach color and the brick to a red. So now as I look at those layers in the view here, it's a little easier to visualize them. I have a better idea of what's happening in the scene because my layers are color-coded in relationship to what they actually are. Now, as I'm dragging, you notice the quality drops. That's because we're using an adaptive quality, adaptive resolution as we drag. If you don't want that to happen, then as you drag, it'll start to re-render, but you have to do that there for each of the views. And then as you drag, you won't see the drop in quality, but you may see a little bit of stuttering. So it's ultimately up to you, the quality you view at as you drag through. All right, to start this work, it all begins inside Adobe Photoshop. You need to open up the images and start to split them apart. Ideally, you're going to make some selections. Stay away from the magic, also known as the tragic wand, and instead look at things like the quick selection tool or some of the select commands that are powered by AI. The quick selection tool works great. Color range is also useful, and it's not a bad idea to refine the edge to clean things up. Then, once you have holes, you can take advantage of things like the clone stamp, the healing brush, vanishing point. There's the pattern maker to make repeating patterns for things like brick or grass, content-aware fill or patch, or even the new generative AI. And then get everything properly labeled. Make sure each layer has a clear and descriptive name that identifies it. And if you've got lots of layers and you don't need them separated, consider using things like smart objects to merge them together non-destructively. Once it's all set, you can reduce the number of layers to just the essential ones. And as far as resolution goes, remember, 4,000 pixels is usually enough for standard HD or web, but you're going to need more than that if you're going to be going to 4K. Okay, let's go here to Photoshop and we'll open up an image. All right, I jump forward to the end state here and you can see the different pieces. There's our statue. Here's the pillar itself. Let's just finesse that in a little bit with the pillar. Grab the clone stamp. I'm on the pillar layer and I can just fill that in a little bit with a gentle brush stroke. Like such. But the statue is going to be in front of it, so I don't actually need that to be a perfect edge. All right, that looks pretty good. But if you download the VIP bundle, you can get an in-depth tutorial on all the cleanup that we did inside of Photoshop there instead of the abbreviated version. All right, that looks good. Let's save our work and talk about After Effects for a moment. Once you get into After Effects, you're going to build the comp out. You do this by importing the layered file and end up with a stack. I suggest you have the full composited image on the top and then put the foreground, subject, and background in there. That's quite useful. Since we want a copy on top, one way to do that is to go over here and make an empty layer and then hold down the Option key or Alt key when you choose Layer, Merge Visible. And it'll give you the flattened version on top. And we'll call that Reference. That's going to help as we position things later. Okay, so we got the composite image and then our different layers here. Let's switch on over to After Effects and make a new comp. Here we go, just put a new project together. Double click. And we'll bring in that file. There it is. And instead of Photoshop bringing it in as footage, import it as composition. Choose normal composition, not retain layer size. It's really important that you don't choose this. This is going to get in the way of the technique. So just regular composition. And you can tell it to bring it in and click OK. Now if I open this up, you'll see it brought it in with layers intact. There's the forest, the pillars, the statue, and the reference photo. Now you can see that that pillar is not perfect. We can touch that up later if needed. You don't have to have perfection when you first do this. Just figure out the moves and then go back into Photoshop and fill in any areas or defocus it as needed. This is good. So let's go ahead and rename this composition. I'll press the return key and call it starter. And now I'm going to duplicate that and call it camera move. Now, with this intact, we'll open it up. And actually, let's just call that camera because we'll add the move separately. You don't have to use all of these different comps. I just like to sometimes to have easier undo points or if I'm teaching. Okay, first off, let's add a new camera. Layer, new camera. And there's a whole bunch of presets here, but generally speaking, you're going to do a 2-node camera, which gives you the ability to pivot and swing, and then look at the different focal lengths and match something up that's close to what you had. I'm going to go that this was a standard 50mm lens, but you can also check the metadata if it's a digital image and match it precisely. Also choose the option here to enable depth of field. See it right here? Make sure that's turned on. That's going to give you the ability to have shallow depth of field. Now what I could do is click OK. Now, nothing much happens at first because you don't have any 3D layers. In order to see these, you're going to have to click the switches and modes. So click over here and then promote them to 3D space by changing the layers you want to be 3D. There we go. And what we can do now is turn off the reference image for a second. Now, before we start changing the comp size, we're going to position the layers in 3D space. Now, before we start changing the composition size for delivery, we're going to move the layers in 3D space. First up, let's take a look at the forest. What I need to do is push this away from the camera. Now that's going to create the depth. I suggest you go to 2 views to make this a little easier. And on the left, just take a look at one of those views, such as that custom view 1, 45 degrees to the left, 45 degrees up. On the right, make sure you're taking a look through the active camera so you see what's happening. Select the layer and press P for position, and then drag it back along the Z-axis. If you hold the Shift key, it moves faster. So now it's further away, it's back there. But what we need to do is scale it back up so it fills the frame. If I press S for scale, I can now drag and scale it up until it matches the edges approximately. But here's a cool trick. Turn that reference layer on that you imported, and what you can do is change its blending mode. Just take a look there at switches and modes. There it is. We got that reference layer on, and we'll click switches and modes, and we're just going to change the blending mode of that and take a look at something that shows what's different between the 2 layers. Now, you can do something like difference and actually see it pretty well. And watch as I adjust the scale here. When you see an actual difference there, it tells you that the pixels haven't lined up. But when the area goes black, there's effectively no difference, which is fine. Now, obviously, the pillars and statue are different, but the forest looks more or less correct. So if I turn that layer off, I've scaled it to an appropriate size now. I've got a pretty good idea what's happening. Let's zoom out here. Use the comma key, and you can zoom out a little bit. Spacebar lets you pan around. And turn on the pillar next. All right, not bad. We're going to push that a little bit away. P for position. And just push it a little bit back in Z space. It's got to be a little bit away from our statue. Then S for scale, and just scale it back up. And remember, you can use that reference photo there to help you as you do this, and scale it until you start to get the black pixels again. All right, now the pillars in the forest have lined back up to their original place. We could turn on the statue layer, and the whole frame is black, or at least pretty darn close to it. You don't have to be perfect. So I can call that good. Now I'll turn off the reference layer, and what we've done is we've created the scene in 3 dimensions, which is awesome. Okay, now that we got that, let's go ahead and add a layer. I'm going to go in and choose Layer New, Light. We're going to start by adding an ambient light. This is the base lighting level for the scene. And just like a studio, don't start at 100%. Darken that so the room's a little darker and you get a little bit of light going on there. Now, if you look at switches and modes, it has to be a 3D layer if it's going to be affected by the light. And I can also come down here to the forest layer and choose the layer settings here. Now, what I want to think about this is what's going to happen with this particular layer. It's out there. It's probably not being affected by the same light here, actually. So we're going to modify and control that a little bit better. Okay, now that we got the base lighting of the scene, let's add another light. In this case, we're going to add in a basic sort of spotlight effect, so it's a little bit directional. And I can even take the eyedropper and sample on sort of the color of the light that's back there. Now let's turn that ambient light off for just a second. I'll hit OK. And then reopen up the spotlight settings. And just sample on the color of the light coming through the trees. It's pretty bright white, but you can choose something that's a little more golden or something in there just to match the light of the scene. There we go. Click OK. And now we'll open up that spotlight. What I can do now is control the angle of the light and how much feather it has, if it's a hard edge or a softer edge. Not bad. Let's take a look at the scene here and position things a bit. Period key takes you in, and if you click on items, you can kind of actually see them. So now we can drag things and move them around. Notice how I can just put that light and actually point it, or just grab it here and point it where you want. If you double click on the light, you can still refine the angle of the light. So there, let's have a little bit of the overhang from the roof and the amount of feather. So we're just going to get a little bit of transition there. So there's a light source at the roof. And as needed, you can move the light up, point it, etc. It's all controllable. And look at how it's creating shadow on the scene. It's really cool. So I like that, as if the light was coming in from the overhang from behind and hitting the statues. Pretty cool. All right, we've got the scene blocked out. That's really quite awesome how that's come together. Let's go ahead and animate now. We'll select this and duplicate and just rename the sequence and call it camera move. Open it up and let's adjust the sequence size. I'll go to my composition settings and I'm just going to deliver this for social media because it's a smaller size graphic and it was just meant for the web. And let's do a nice social media square here and click OK. There it is. We've got our scene and we're just going to reveal things. So if I click on the camera, we can start to animate. I'll twirl it down so I can see all the controls a bit better. And what I'm looking at here is a couple of options. If you select the layer here, like the statue layer, there's a really cool option under the right click for camera. And this allows us to actually set the focus on this layer. So I'll link the focus distance to this layer. All we have to do here is choose the camera to go with it. And now, when I link the focus distance, the box moves to stay right on the subject, which is cool. So now as we move the camera around, it's going to actually keep the focus distance there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the transform controls, and we'll just start to move the camera into place. So I'm going to have the camera start a little closer to the subject. Look at how the focus box moves with it. It's perfect. It's a really cool effect. And I'm just moving this into place. And what I want to do is start a little lower on the base of the statue. Now we can turn this on. Point of interest and position defines where this is looking at. Let's go forward in time. We'll make this sequence not so long. 10 seconds should be plenty for the web. And I'm going to drop the frame rate to 15 frames per second for the web and set the duration to 10 seconds. All right. So I want this to end up around the 8-second mark with the camera having pulled up and revealed the subject. So let's move up like such. That's pretty good. And let's actually move those keyframes forward a little bit to about the 6-second mark. So I just dragged them forward, and you can see that the camera pulls up and reaches it. Then by the 8-second mark, what I want to do is have the camera pull back a little bit to reveal more of the scene. There we go. I can't go too far or I start to see outside of the room. And then we can adjust the angle a little bit by just tweaking where the point of interest is looking at. And we can just push that back in a little bit to stay inside of the pillar border. And let's adjust the point of interest here on the y-axis to look down a little bit. And this is pretty cool, watch. So the camera pulls up and then back. Now, that wasn't the real speed. It was just the preview. But here's what's happening. I like that. It's just a little choppy, but we're going to fix that. So what we can do here is just refine things a little bit. So to begin, we'll select these keyframes and say, Keyframe Assistant, ease out. What that'll do is create a little bit of resistance as it leaves. Then select these and say Keyframe Assistant, ease in. And for these middle ones, it's quite simple. Just right-click on them and choose Rove Across Time, and After Effects will intelligently place them in the right spot so that the move doesn't look jerky. All right, here we go. Let's cache before playback, not enable full screen. And now it should play back smoothly on the second pass. It lifts up and pulls back. Not bad. And you can continue to refine these as needed, giving you that smooth move. Let's go back to 30 frames per second for a moment and just take a look and preview. And here it is in real time. Not bad. Just we're going to make it a little smoother. So on these last two keyframes, let's not go quite so far back. So we'll take that camera position and just move it a little closer and swing it a little more to the right. And just tweak the point of interest. And you'll notice that the roving keyframes actually adjust themselves. It's pretty cool. Here, let's also start to pull the camera back a little bit so it's not so close to the subject. And we'll choose this one here. K key moves me over. And we can refine that just a little bit. Pull back a little. All right. Now let's remove those in between frames, and you see the Rove Across Time recalculates. Cool. And there's our move. Revealing the scene. Lifts up and pulls back and lifts down. Very cool. And remember, with each of these keyframes as needed, you can refine. So if the point of interest doesn't feel quite right, you can adjust. Let's see a little more of that roof, for example. So it will pull straight up and then start to arc and come back to reveal more. Very cool. Okay, let's take a look at two more techniques. Here, I've got a project where we've brought in this arch. It's just a single layer, but instead of using a still, we're going to add some footage next. I've included a night sky time lapse. This is just one of mine, and you can drag that behind the layer. And we're going to scale these a little bit. So looking at the composition here, let's check our comp settings. And it's a little bit bigger than we need. I'm just going to drop this down to 720p. There we go. There we go. And let's add a few things. We're looking up through the arch. undo. All right, we dragged in the footage layer there. It's a time-lapse sky. And let's just shorten this up a little bit to about 12 seconds. There we are. Now we'll make both layers 3D. And add a 3D camera. Now, I'm not sure what settings to use here, so I'm going to cancel for a second, select this movie, and press Command E to open it up in Photoshop. Now what I can do is take a look at some of the information. I'll go into the File Info and over to Camera Data. And I see the focal length is 78 millimeters in 35 millimeter film. And the aperture was f14. Well, I can do something with this for sure. So let's come back to After Effects, add that camera again. And it was 78 millimeters here. Let's use a preset that's close. There's 80. And I see the focal length here, so I can go to 78. And then the f-stop was 14. And I can click OK. That's pretty cool. And in this case, we don't actually need the depth of field effect, so I'll turn it off. All right, now we need to start to move things around a little bit. Let's select the 2-comp view. And on the left here, I'm going to go with the Custom View 1 to see things in space. And on the right is the active camera. Now in this case, I don't have to worry too much about what's realistic. I just need to push that sky back a bit. So we'll get that further away, pushing into outer space. Yes, that's a bad joke. And then S for scale, and I'm just going to scale it up until it fills the edges. Now in this case, that's pretty cool. I've got this time-lapse shot of mine that I made of the night sky, and you can see as things slowly move through. I really like that. Now, this is coming together, but let's talk about color grading for a moment. Daytime arch, night sky. Not quite working, but here's what's cool. Let's add a new ambient light. There we go. And I'll eyedropper on the color of the sky. There we go. And we'll set that as the ambient light. And click OK for a moment. Now, that's pretty dark, but that's pretty cool. Look at how it's picking up the color of the night sky. Now, double click on the light and just start to adjust the intensity. That's pretty awesome. There we go. And I'll just click and adjust up the brightness ever so slightly here on the HSB. There we go. Let's go a touch darker. Click OK. And add a lower light now, one that's pointed up at this. So I'll say Layer, New, Light. We'll go with a little bit brighter here. Click OK. And add it. Now, let's look at where it's placed. Here's that. Oops, undo. Now let's add another light. Layer, New, Light. Let's add another light. Layer, New, Light. In this case, a spotlight. And click OK. And what we're going to do is kind of position this a little bit. Going to lower that down and sort of tilt it up here. There we go. But here's the deal. I don't want that lighting up the object in the background. Now, what we can do here is control this a bit. So I'm going to twirl down the night sky layer and come here to the material options. And what we want to do is tell this to not accept lights. So I'll just come down here where it says accept lights and say off. Now that back sky is not actually accepting a light. See, there it is, on versus off. That's pretty cool. We can also say whether or not it accepts shadows, which I think we're going to want shadows on there. So there's off, on. It's okay, it's pretty far away. Let's come here and take a look at the other layer while we're at it, under Material Options. And I can see what's happening. Does it accept things? So there's the ability there to cast shadows. I don't think we need that, so we can say off. But looking at this here, we can play with the intensity. Does it accept the light? Yes. Does it accept shadows? Yes. Now, I like this. Let's play with a few options here. I'm adjusting the intensity of the light, as well as playing with options like the color. I think I like the blue best, but a little bit brighter. There we go. We can adjust the feather there so that there's a little more shadow on that night arch. That looks pretty good. Click OK. And let's go to the ambient light here and just take that down a bit. There we go. Now we're getting more of a sense of lighting. That's pretty cool. All right, let's duplicate this comp. And we'll call this one Animate. For this one, we'll change the composition settings a little bit. Let's get it into the 720p size for now. And we can animate the camera. I'm going to switch here and pull this out a little bit. I can see we're really pulled from pretty far away, but that actually matches the type of lens we had. So now let's tweak it. Using the settings here, I'll adjust the camera option. I'm going to start and tweak here the transformations, point of interest and position. Let's drop this a little bit. It's a little lower. There we go. And I'm going to keyframe the zoom as well. Now we can go forward, start to zoom out a bit, like so. Revealing the arch, and let's just adjust the position a little. Now, I like that. In this case, I'm just going to scale that night sky up a little bit more. I can go bigger to have a little overshoot if I want. So that gives me a little bit more room to swing the camera. And let's tweak that point of interest. We'll start looking up. So now it zooms and pulls back, and we see the night sky cutting through. I love using time-lapse for these type of techniques. You can get stock clips of this, or you can make your own like I did here. In any case, the use of lighting is what really sells this. But let's make this look a little more photorealistic. What I'm going to do is just add a vignette. So I'll choose Layer, New, Solid. Now, eyedropper on one of the darkest shadows in there, but pick up a hint of the color and click OK. Come on over and grab your ellipse tool, and with the layer selected, double click. It adds a mask. Twirl it down, invert it, and put a good old heavy feather on it. Now, with the blending modes adjusted, you can easily refine this. I'm going to go with a mode like Multiply to mix the color in. And then I'll press T for opacity, and I can adjust just ever so slightly. And that gives us a little darkening at the edges to make that look more realistic, which is pretty cool. Now, for those of you who pick up the VIP bonus pack, you're going to learn how to take a photo that looks like this and bring it into After Effects using the puppet tool. We're going to do something like this and bring it to life. Crazy, right? Be sure to check out that extra tutorial in your VIP bundle. All right, I hope you enjoyed taking a look at these techniques. They're a lot of fun, aren't they? You can find more of my content over at LinkedIn Learning, and you can also connect on LinkedIn if you are a business user. If you want to get in touch on other social media platforms, I post, not super often, but I am there, and you can look me up and hear about upcoming events, activities, or just things that I'm doing. And if you'd like to get some help, be sure to head on over to Photo Focus. This is a website that I've been a part of for many years. It's a great photography site, and there's all sorts of articles and education. And if you're thinking about coming to Las Vegas live, do so. It'd be great to connect. I'll be speaking at the upcoming post-production world there, and it's an opportunity to get additional training in person, as well as enjoy Las Vegas. You can scan to find out more info. Thanks again for coming out to the After Effects Summit, and to Dave Cross for organizing this event. Look forward to catching up in one of my other classes. Thanks for coming out.